Hi, everyone. Good evening, good day, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Alberto Carrillo. I'm Chief Technical Officer for the Science-Based Targets Initiative, and I'm very happy to be with you today to share basically more about the Net Zero standard that the SBTi launched exactly 1 year ago in COP years, not the exact same day. But yeah, last year we were celebrating on the Thursday of the second week at COP26 that we had just launched the Net Zero standard that basically, intended to provide a clear pathway for how to set targets, net zero targets based on science for the corporate sector. And so in a way for us, today is the first year anniversary, so we want to share with you some of, well, first of all, what the standard is, and then also what has happened since the standard, and to hear from our experts and guests to how this relates to other parts of the ecosystem. So first of all, I mean, we know why we are here, right? I think if we didn't know, we wouldn't be in this place right now. So we are facing a critical crisis, and not only a crisis, a climate crisis, also a nature crisis. And so we have clarity from science in terms of the transformation that needs to happen. And this clarity has been around already for a few years. Since the IPCC released the special report on 1.5 degrees, it was clear, first of all, that there's the urgency to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. And despite some of the politics around it, the science is clear, right? Exceeding 1.5 degrees implies high risks for society, high risks for ecosystems, and so there's a clear limit that we need to adhere to, and that's the basis of what we do and why we exist as initiative. When the special report was released, but even before that, we saw the need to drive the adoption of climate targets that basically are based on what science tells us is needed to stabilize global warming. We started with first movers, really companies that believed in the need to address the climate crisis with the urgency that is needed. And fortunately, the number has grown. Basically, today we have around 4,000 companies that are setting science-based targets. These companies represent about 1/3 of the global market capitalization. And 96% of these companies have Scope 3 targets. About 3/4 of these companies are already 1.5 degree aligned. And I would say the most important thing in the context of the climate negotiations and the process that is being discussed here is there evidence that the corporate sector is moving under the Paris Agreement is being implemented in the real economy, and that we can decarbonize different value chains, right? And this is key for us to be able to continue to progress. Now, let me tell you a little bit more about the Net Zero standard. The Net Zero standard is basically setting the different components for what is needed for a credible net zero transition for companies. And the first component of the Net Zero standard, and acknowledging the urgency to take action in the short term, companies are expected to set greenhouse gas emission reduction targets in the short term. That means basically targets that have a 5 to 10 year time frame that basically ensures that companies start reducing emissions in the short term. Then the second component is the commitment to achieve deep decarbonization, right? Deep decarbonization is not something that will happen overnight. It's not something that will happen in the near term, but it's something that needs to happen. I cannot compete with that. But yeah, we need companies to also commit to achieve deep decarbonization, and as soon as possible and no later than 2050. And in the Science-Based Target Net Zero Standard, we specify what we mean by deep decarbonization based on the level of decarbonization that needs to be reached in different activities, different sectors of the economy, based on 1.5 degree aligned scenarios. The third component is there's some emissions that may remain once we reach deep decarbonization in some activities, in some sectors. And these emissions need to be neutralized. They need to be counterbalanced so that they don't cause accumulation of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And for those emissions, basically, the expectation is that they are counterbalanced with carbon removals. This is, I would say, a tiny part of the net zero transition. The net zero standard we're talking about basically 5 to 10% of the emissions that we have today. So the effort really needs to be put on decarbonizing our economy and in protecting our ecosystems. And finally, it is also important to incentivize and to contribute to decarbonization in other parts of the economy. That's what we call beyond value chain mitigation. And this is basically with the intention of encouraging companies to go beyond what they need to do to transform their own business and to contribute to the net zero transition in society by contributing also with finance and with nature conservation. Now, the process that companies go through is first, of course, we need to start with a clear foundation of the footprint of companies and a base year. Then, they calculate their emissions. The boundaries that companies set when they set net zero targets, we follow something that we call an expansive boundary, which basically means they need to start with targets that can be actionable in the short term, but ultimately, by the time they reach net zero emissions, the targets need to cover basically the entire value chain, 90% of the boundary. Yeah, you go to the next slide, please. Now, something that is very important is in the SBTi, we follow a mitigation hierarchy. And that means that, first of all, our priority is to incentivize and to ensure that carbon is not emitted in the first place, right? And that applies both to fossil carbon that is currently stored underground, and also to biogenic carbon that is above the surface. And the first priority, I would say, the most important priority for us is to make sure that we stop getting carbon out of underground and that we continue to convert ecosystems. Then, in terms of our mitigation hierarchy, the second priority is to incentivize companies to provide finance, to contribute to the finance that is needed to support the transition in other parts of the economy. And then in the longer term, for residual emissions that cannot be eliminated, then the expectation is for companies to neutralize those emissions, right? We are not requiring or incentivizing companies to remove emissions today. This is something that will be needed in the long term, but right now it's more important and more urgent to channel finance to activities that can prevent carbon from being released into the atmosphere in the first place. Now, we have the net zero standard that is applicable across the different sectors of the economy, but we also develop sector-specific guidance that helps basically understand how to apply the standard to different activities, different sectors, This morning, for instance, we discussed about how to apply the standard to the forest, land use, and agriculture sector. We launched a few weeks ago the standard for cement. We are starting soon consultation for steel. And so the idea is to provide clear guidance that helps companies implement the standard in a consistent way. And you can find all information about the sector-specific guidance on the SBTi website. Something important, as I mentioned, in the SBTi standard, we require in the long term permanent removals of carbon, and also in the short term, we incentivize mitigation and projects that can support conservation of nature. And so both are important part of the solution, but they play these different roles, right? Now, as I mentioned, last year we had just launched the standard, and we launched with 7 companies. And today we have around 100 companies that have already completed the process of applying the standard and setting science-based net zero targets. We have around 1,500 companies that are in the process of setting their targets. Normally companies have 2 years to complete this process. And so I hope next COP we are going to be announcing that we have reached 1,500 companies with approved net zero targets. It's going to be a challenge on us, but that's the expectation. And of course, we want to get all companies to move in this direction. So that's it from me. Now let me invite Emma Watson. Emma was actually the person that led the development of the net zero standard. She's now our head of standards, and she's going to introduce our panel for today.
Thank you, Alberto. Do you guys... Hello, everyone. So thank you so much for joining us this evening. I know there's a lot going on, and it's towards the end of the week, so really appreciate you coming to this session today. And thank you to Alberto for that whistle-stop tour of the Net Zero Standard. So as Alberto mentioned, my name's Emma Watson. I led the process last year to develop the corporate Net Zero Standard, and now my position at the SBTi is Head of Standards. So I'm very, very, very excited to be joined by this amazing panel of women who have been working in this space. So first of all, I'd like to actually ask you to introduce yourselves briefly, and then we'll go into some questions, followed by a roving mic where you can all ask your questions as well. Kaya, do you want to start? Is that working?
Yeah, I think it is. Hi, everyone. I'm Kaya Axelson. I'm the Net Zero Policy Engagement Lead for the University of Oxford. We have a research program, and I help translate that into standards and policy.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here, and thank you for having us here today. My name is Paulina Ponce de Leon. I am a managing director and partner with BCG. As a consulting company, first we've set a science-based target that is aligned to 1.5. We're also very supportive of SBTi and have made climate and sustainability our priority.
Hi everyone, my name is Scarlett Benson. I've recently joined the SBTi to lead the work on beyond value chain mitigation, which Alberto was talking about. And I also have a role working with the Science Based Target Network on developing nature science-based targets. So really sitting at the interplay between nature and climate. And
Great.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you all. So I think for many people in the audience and watching at home, they're going to be quite confused about the number of initiatives surrounding net zero. So we've obviously talked today about the SBTi's corporate net zero standard, We have the Race to Zero, which brings together many initiatives under its umbrella to commit companies to setting net zero targets. And this week, we had the new report from the UN High-Level Expert Group on net zero, as well as the ISO's new guidelines on net zero. So first of all, I'm going to come to Kaya. So first of all, I want to congratulate you. Kaya has been an author on 2 very prominent papers this year on net zero. She was one of the technical authors supporting the ISO process, and she also published a paper on which mapped out the different net zero initiatives and looked at the differences in the criteria and how those align across all of the very many initiatives that there are. First of all, I guess, Kaya, I mean, how do you see all of these initiatives coming together? How do companies make sense of this? And with the new ISO net zero guidelines, what does that add to the picture?
Thanks so much. I always like the joke, if you think there's too many standards, what do people do? They go make another one. It seems to be the way. But I have good news for everyone, which is that from our research, first of all, the reason that I work on standards in the first place is that standards have played a critical role in driving voluntary ambition. In the absence of a regulatory landscape that really brings together what we need to see, which is mandatory action, standards have mobilized the community of ambitious actors in ways that I don't think people would have thought possible a few years ago. So our tracking of companies shows that last year at COP, 1 in 5 of the Forbes 2000 list had a net zero target. And this year it's 1 in 3, and we're probably already out of date because our volunteers are running around COP right now. So I just want to say congratulations to all those who not only work on standards, but also those who mobilize companies behind science-based standards. And I say science-based very intentionally because there's a lot of people, I think, who would like to make standards and call themselves, a credible, but 1.5 is not a target, right? It's a limit. And so if you're not following 1.5 as your framework for the standards you're setting, then you're not credible, in my view. So we took, as Emma said, 33 voluntary initiatives. There are more regulations that are starting to come in the fold, but we limited our scope to voluntary initiatives, and we mapped the hotspot areas. So those might be scope coverage, offsetting, leadership, timing. And the good news for companies, and also the news that means that they have no excuse but to set out their net zero strategies and publish them, is that there's actually quite a bit of convergence on the really hot button issues in the standards landscape. There's a bit of variation where it comes to semantics, and there's certainly variation in the function that different initiatives play. So, for example, the greenhouse gas protocol is kind of the gold standard on measurement. SBTi is really the gold standard on science-based target setting. There's different standards that are mostly coming out of the kind of financial regulatory space, like the TCFD, on governance and so forth. And sometimes they cross-reference with each other, actually quite a lot. We found that a huge number of standards are pointing back to SBTi, like a lot of the standards on offsetting and things are saying, but first you have to make a good target, like an SBTi target. And a lot of them are pointing back to the greenhouse gas protocol. But one of the reasons that I decided I wanted to work on the ISO guidelines, which is not a standard and not something you certify against in the way that you would the SBTi standard, is that I wanted to pull it all into one place. So I want to be very clear, I did not write the ISO guidelines. I was a technical author with over 1,200 participants writing some guidelines. And to have such a participatory process and end up with a similar level of ambition that was aligning and referencing back to these other really important standards that I always point people to, like the SBTi, it was an incredible feat and effort, and not an easy one, as I'm sure Emma will attest, having been with me throughout the process. The other reason that I decided to work on the ISO process, and one way that it differs from the SBTi net zero guidelines, is that the ISO IWA is targeted broadly so as to provide a reference text for rule makers, so for governments. It's something that can be adapted and adopted by different types of organizations, cities, governments, and you can take guidance from it as an organization because, again, it pulls together that stream of, what does it say on governance reporting, what should you be doing to align your lobbying and things that are not necessarily in the target setting standard. It sort of brings it all together into a 45-page document. But again, it does not replace a certified science-based target. And then the third reason that I decided to work on the ISO IWA guidelines is that ISO has 167 member organizations, and these are embedded in nations around the world, right? And some of those member organizations work very closely with policymakers. So I saw that as sort of this conveyor belt of standard development where you have these experts who really understand what it means to get to 1.5, who are talking about target setting. Then the ISO kind of references back to that, among other standards that are developing thought leadership. And then that can get embedded into policy. And then finally, the way that I think ISO, the new IWA, adds value on top of the existing and very important standards landscape is that it's a way for organizations to, I think, seed thought leadership across other standards. So ISO has over 24,000 standards, and they've made a commitment that they're going to update those based on kind of climate thinking. And so I was like, oh, cool. Well, one way to get them to update that is to sort of refer back to their own IWA, their working agreement that they've set as a community of ISO people on what kind of good climate standard is. So those are some of the ways in which it differs, and then I've kind of broken my own joke by contributing to yet another standard, but I hope that sort of helps to break that down.
Amazing, thank you, Kaya. And I guess it would be really good to hear from you, Paulina, the complex landscape. Kaya's described it really well, but it is still very difficult to kind of wrap your head around. You have to think about it a good few times. How would you explain it to someone who is your client or internally at BCG? Is there a simple way of cutting through the fat and getting to that?
Well, I think the focus ends up being the journey that companies need to go through, right? Whether on their own or with others. When they come to us, the question is, where do I get started, and how do I make sure that whatever I commit to and whatever plan that I develop is a credible plan? And at the end of the day, it all goes back to having a plan that is science-based, right? So the way we talk with clients about these and the way that BCG alone went through is, okay, let's understand what our baseline is. Then let's understand what the target should be. And what should that target be? It should always be science-based. It always leads to SBTi. And then how do we report about it? And yes, there's an alphabet soup out there. We map it out. But I think at the end of the day, like you were saying, there's a gold standard in each step along the way. I think it's important to highlight that. The other thing is, especially when we think about the race to zero, there's some stuff that you can do on your own, but it's really about mobilizing the full ecosystem and being a participant in that. So we help companies understand what do they need to do on their own, what can they do with others, where can they learn with others, and that starts the conversation. I will say, however, I am very excited that things are getting aligned and building on each other, because what will drive companies crazy and what slows us down is when things are inconsistent. So the more that we can build on each other and the more that we can be supportive of the good standards that are out there, I think the better.
Hello? Okay, great. So now we'll move on to a slightly different topic. And Scarlett, this question's coming for you. So when Alberto explained the different steps for a company to set a net zero target, one of the ones that he mentioned was beyond value chain mitigation. So this is a pretty new term that's come about recently, and it's very jargony. So it would be great to hear from you, Scarlett. What is beyond value chain mitigation? What are we planning to do there? And yeah.
Yeah,
Thank you.
sure. So I think Alberto did a good job of kind of explaining why it's important, but maybe I'll just reiterate that as a starting point. So yes, SBTi has over 4,000 companies committed with validated targets, representing about a third of the world's market capitalization. So that's incredible for a voluntary standard. But even if all of those companies deliver on their science-based targets, we're still at quite a high risk of not achieving 1.5. And that's because, it is my view that in the absence of regulation, not every company in the world is going to set a voluntary target. And it's also because there are emissions that frankly fall outside of the value chains of companies, or potentially that nationally determined contributions aren't sufficiently ambitious. And so there is a real role of companies that have significant amount of capital to be able to support global efforts to get to net zero by going above and beyond this kind of minimum target to get to 1.5. And I think, as Kayla said, it's the 1.5 goal is not like a target; it's a limit of warming, and so we really should be trying to increase ambition beyond that. So, what is beyond value chain mitigation? Well, I think there have been some misconceptions about what SBTi's position is on this. I've often heard people say, SBTi doesn't allow offsetting, or SBTi only allows removals. And there is some nuance on this that I think does need clarification. So beyond value chain mitigation is really, if you have your science-based target, you're reducing in line with science along either the kind of cross-sector pathway or a sectoral pathway, and you're going above and beyond. You're investing in climate mitigation in addition. That could be through the purchasing of carbon credits as one example, whether that be emissions reductions carbon credits, so RED Plus potentially, or through removals. Both of those things would count as beyond value chain mitigation. So because you're doing it in addition. I often avoid the word offsetting because I think it can be quite confusing. If you buy a carbon credit on top of a science-based emissions reduction pathway, that is in addition. It's not to substitute internal abatement. So I tend to talk about carbon credits instead of offsetting, because going above and beyond a science-based target is fantastic, and it really is delivering this sort of global mitigation. So what are we doing within the development of the guidance? So I'm actually only a month in, which is quite a daunting task, and it seems like this topic has been very much a hot topic at COP this year. So I kind of am trying to communicate it around 5 W's, which is what we're doing. So the first is what. So what counts as beyond value chain mitigation? I've made it. I hope I made it clear. It is removals and it is reductions. It's not. We need both of those. But there are some questions about other types of things. Potentially, would we include adaptation or avoided emissions? So we really need to work through what is going to count within our guidance as beyond value chain mitigation, with the aim of driving climate finance at scale where it's most urgently needed. So that's the what. Where, as I say, where is climate finance most urgently needed? We know that there are many ecosystems that are close to dangerous tipping points where they could release huge amounts of carbon into the atmosphere. And so, targeting climate finance to these places where it is most urgent is absolutely critical. Similarly, we know that we are going to need some level of removals, to achieve net zero. And those removals are currently very costly, and we can't deliver all of them through the land sector. And so there is a role for kind of investing today to bring down the costs of some of these removal technologies. So that's the kind of the where, and also the when, because when does that investment need to happen? The next one is who. So who pays? Do we just require every company to essentially counterbalance their unabated emissions in a given year? Or do we have some nuance for different sectors, taking into account that some sectors have higher profits, or they have different levels of costs to abate their own internal emissions? So this is really a question of allocation, and how do we kind of equitably incentivize companies to pay? And then the final one, which I've kind of just mentioned, is the why, and this is my favorite one. Why would companies do this? And it's a bit difficult to think about. Lots of people talk about claims. Will a claim where a company is able to say, you know, we have net zero plus beyond value chain mitigation, is that going to be sufficient to get companies to start to do this? It may be. A claim, I think, is important, certainly for certain sectors where they can make a marketing claim. But I think the reality is that, you know, as I said, 4,000 companies are part of the SBTi, and they've done that voluntarily. They haven't been required to do it by regulation. And so companies clearly see the benefit of aligning with, you know, efforts globally to reach 1.5 degrees. And so I really hope that we can, you know, emphasize that going above and beyond is what an ambitious company needs to do in order to be part of a sort of a 1.5 degree world. So we are thinking through within the development of this guidance, you know, how can we as SBTi create some of these incentives, as well as like what is the role of other players within the system in terms of incentivizing this. So yeah, the guidance, we'll be publishing it. The aim is next summer. It will really set out the kind of different approaches that companies can take, the guardrails of integrity, both kind of from an environmental but also a social perspective, and how do we make sure that companies are really transparently reporting on this so that they can be held to account. So yeah, a very busy year ahead. Yeah, thank you.
Great, thank you, Scarlett. That was really clear. And if anyone's interested in finding out more, we did just publish a recent blog series on the topic, so you can find out about that on our website. But sticking to the same topic, I'm going to come to you, Paulina. So we know that companies are struggling to set and achieve their targets in alignment with 1.5C. The science it's necessary, but very, very challenging. With Beyond Value Chain Mitigation, we're asking companies to do even more than reduce all of those emissions quite steeply and drastically. So, Paulina, have you seen any companies doing this really well? And if so, what are the incentives? Why are they doing it?
Yeah, there are several companies that have set science-based targets and are going above and beyond. I think, first of all, it's a recognition that a lot of the companies could do that and go above and beyond, and it still would not be enough to do our fair share of what's needed to tackle these climate crisis. But then, in addition to the planetary and people reasons, there are business reasons to do these, right? One, there's tremendous finance that can be unlocked through these, and finance that needs to get channeled to the solution, some of the solutions that we need. So an example of the solutions that Scarlett was talking about are nature-based solutions, right? We know that today, just as an example, we're only funding about 1/4 of the financing that's needed to have the nature-based solutions at scale for 2030. And most of that is being driven by the public sector. So if you can really mobilize the private sector here, that there's tremendous potential there. We also talk about the concept of sustainability scarcity. More and more, whether it's carbon credits or avoidance or removals or the technologies that we need of tomorrow, they're going to be they will be increasingly demanded for, and there will not be enough supply. So companies that are starting to engage in these sort of activities now are in many ways, one, securing the supply that they will need. They're developing the knowledge that's needed. They're helping bring down the cost curves of the technologies if they're investing in them. And it's one of the things that will also just help scale and be very important. So there are many, in addition to doing the right thing, which I think a lot of companies want to do, there are business reasons to do these. I do want to say one more thing, because we talk about the incentives for companies to do it. There can also be disincentives for it. And a lot of what we hear companies say they're very, very afraid of being accused of greenwashing. And there are many companies that are doing the right thing, that are trying to make sure that they're doing the right thing. But at the same time, they're petrified of being misconstrued or misstepping along the way. And I think we need to make sure that we're providing guidance of what's credible, which is why this guidance is going to be important, of what we consider to be high quality, and also recognize that everyone is going to be learning along the way, right? And so we need to, in some ways, also reward risk-taking and lesson sharing and enable that system to make sure that we don't slow down. We need to accelerate here.
Great, thank you, Paulina. And I guess that kind of touches on the kind of more recent phrase of green hushing that we've been seeing companies being very quiet about the action that they're taking for fear of greenwash accusations. So going on to my final question, I'm going to ask this to you, Kaya, but feel free, Paulina, Scarlett, to chime in, and also then we'll have a good amount of time for you guys to ask your questions, so start thinking. But one thing a lot of people might not realize is that the SBTi never intended to be around for this long. When it was formed in 2015, we did expect that we would be disbanded because we'd be taken over by regulation, and that hasn't happened. We have seen some encouraging moves recently, so the recent announcement from the White House that the US federal government is going to require its large suppliers to set science-based targets, which is great, but maybe not what we would have originally hoped for. So Kaya, what do you see as the future of regulation and moving away from voluntary action now with the more recent developments?
Yeah, I just want to say that every really good mission-based organization wants to end itself. So thank you for that. And as much as I think that we have made some strides recently on regulation, we are abysmally far from where we need to go. I mean, we should be shocked with our governments on this level, right? So 22 years ago, the first voluntary disclosure framework was put together under kind of the title of CDP. And it's only now that we're starting to see mandatory disclosure come in. But it's coming in fast. So that's the good news on disclosure, although that seems to be the only real regulatory space where we're making significant gains. So our mapping that we've done, our initial mapping that we've done, shows that about 50% of both GDP and population will be covered by mandatory disclosure by 2025, which is a calculation adding up about 7 major jurisdictions in the world that are going to be putting forward some kind of mandatory disclosure framework loosely based off the TCFD. So that's kind of like if you've ever been to a dinner table with someone and you really know that their politics are quite different from you, but you really want to get them on side. And so your tactic to sort of bring them around is to ask them a lot of really nice open-ended questions, right? But we shouldn't be there on climate cooperation. We should not be at the stage where we're kind of like, oh, but Uncle Jim, I know that you don't believe in my basic rights, but maybe we should. What you really want is something that's normative that says, actually, you want to get to 1.5, you want to help us do beyond value chain mitigation, you want to save a future for our children, here's what you have to do. Fill out this questionnaire, but also here's your answers. We don't have anything like that at the moment, except for in certain cases where we're starting to see procurement laws, because a lot of time procurement is something that the executive in my government, the executive can do, and it doesn't have to pass through Congress. I think we're going to start seeing more of that kind of mandatory disclosure stuff. So it's not just going to ask a nice question, but and it's good. The questions are good. I think procurement products, transition plans that have a bit more of a normative nudge, that's where we'd really like to see. But then that's kind of, I'm aware that I'm speaking from a very sort of like Western, Northern headquarter lens. There's also going to need to be a whole suite of policy instruments that are better for the global south, that are better for SMEs, that are better for emerging markets. And we really have to start with the sectors that are responsible for the highest degree of emissions. I don't think a regulatory approach that is economy-wide will work because carbon pricing hasn't worked.
I love that, Kaya. That was very funny. So now we have some time for your questions. So is anyone... I think I saw your hand first. Shall I go? Oh, okay.
I just want to say, poor Uncle Jim, if he is not a fictional character, you've just outed him.
Hi, Pauline, Carbon Trust. I think maybe a question for you, Kaya. I'm based in the Amsterdam office of the Carbon Trust, so focusing on Europe. And something I often encounter with companies we're talking to is they really dislike net zero. They don't know what it means because the EU seems to really want to stick to its carbon neutral target. So, the discussion always goes back to carbon neutrality. So do you think now that ISO has brought out a net zero standard and, as you said, kind of lays the ground a bit for perhaps regulatory action on net zero, that will help in some jurisdictions that are still focusing a bit too much on carbon neutrality versus net zero?
Yeah, I'm going to have to blame the French on this one. So the reason that we have a carbon neutrality coalition between nations and that has kind of become the main frame for nations is that that's what the term is in French. It's truly a language thing. And I really think that corporations need to look at the guidance that's being set out for them and what it actually means in terms of what the standards say for corporations. And they can say, I know it's confusing, but they can say, look, we have both a carbon neutral target, which is something different from net zero, and we have a net zero target, and those are both going towards France's carbon neutrality or the Europe's carbon neutrality efforts and goals. At the end of the day, you have to go with what the emerging best practice is saying. And there's a really important distinction, I think, partly because carbon neutral is on all these products and so forth, and there's a lot more, especially in the ISO carbon neutrality standard, there's a lot more leeway on the use of credits. And so if they're really worried about greenwashing, they would see net zero as a higher standard and try to move towards that.
Yeah, so I'd like to add something there. I think part of the work is obviously educating all of these clients, right? So and you're nodding, but sometimes they're afraid of it or they don't like it because they don't fully understand it. And it's very difficult for people who are actually leading the sustainability team within their companies to educate others inside the company as well and to make the business case. So I think it's on us and to make sure that we're very clear about what each of the standards ask. We've been doing some research on Scope 3, for example, and one of the things that we found out is that most companies don't even know what's allowed to include and what would count to meet their Scope 3 targets, right? So there's a huge educational effort that we need to go underway, but we also need to make it very easy for people to convey the value and the business case of sustainability. And I will just say that for me, it gives me great pleasure to have clients come to us, companies come to us and say, hey, our shareholders are asking us about our climate strategy, and hey, our board is asking us what our climate plan is, and our employees are really asking for it, and our customers are really asking for it, because yes, we need regulation and that's what's going to scale it, but to me, this says that the pressure is working and that the strategies that a lot of what civil society and WWF, SBTi, CDP and others have been working on for years, it's working and we need more of that.
I've lost, oh, there you are. Okay, sorry.
Thank you very much. I think this is an excellent panel. All women making an impact. My name is Bramley. I work on large-scale restoration of ecosystems from source to sea. So from the eastern Himalayas all the way to mangrove ecosystems, both in Myanmar and Bangladesh and India. And there are voluntary standards like the VCS, the American-based standard, and the gold standard, and also the Plan Vivo. But those are meant for land-based and forestry owners and projects in the field, while this one actually measures companies who actually buy those credits from the field with regards to clean energy, stove, whatever. I was wondering if this standard also kind of links with those old standards like the Plan Vivo, the VCS, the gold standards to pick projects. And also if you have the same kind of monitoring, verification, and assessment for companies, if they're greenwashing, if they're talking the talk, or they just, wishy-washy. Like, I think it was Deutsche Bank that got raided by German federal police recently for greenwashing. But now I think companies have to be very careful of what they say and do, because I think a lot of young consumers now question everything you buy. So I think there will come a time when companies that are not sustainable will be out of business just because young people will not buy their products anymore because they use forced labor or they're destroying ecosystems and so on. I mean, this is great that we're measuring carbon, but what about the other impacts at an ecological scale, which is damaging the water? Like, I know there's a company dumping toxic water into the ocean here in the Red Sea. The BBC found out about it just recently. What about that kind? It's not captured in emissions, or destroying land, or hurting indigenous people, or something that is way beyond carbon. How do we hold them accountable for that? That is not captured on the science-based target right now.
Yeah, that's a great question, thank you. And maybe, Emma, you can answer the MRV one, the monitoring, and I can maybe take the bit about carbon credits and how we link with Verra, gold standard, etc. So I sort of think about it that the SBTi is really looking at the demand side of integrity. So, you know, how much do you, if you're buying carbon credits on top of your science-based target, how should you use them? What should you claim about the use of them? Whereas Gold Standard and Verra and all of these other standards, Trees as an example, which is looking at jurisdictional red, they're really looking at what is the integrity of that carbon credit from a supply side. So is it delivering real mitigation? Is it delivering benefits to the communities? Is it having a biodiversity impact? So we're not trying to duplicate essentially what any of those standards are doing. They're very much aligned. So we, you know, SBTi is looking at the demand side and they look at the supply side. What we'll be doing in the Beyond Value Chain Mitigation guidance is really pointing to the standards that are working on the supply side that we see as high integrity. So maybe that's the answer to the first question. The second part of the question was about what about everything else? What about pollution? What about biodiversity? I mentioned very briefly when I introduced myself that I'm also working with the Science Based Target Network, which is affiliated with the Science Based Target Initiative. It's been inspired by it. It's seen that, you know, the huge progress in terms of getting companies to sign up and start setting these targets and implementing. And it's essentially broadening the concept beyond climate to look at other nature outcomes. So it's lots of companies want those targets to be ready today, and I often say, you know, it's very difficult. We don't have the IPCC. Well, we do, but we don't have quite the same levels of different nature pathways. We don't understand. We don't have a kind of a globally agreed 1.5 degree goal. We don't have the greenhouse gas protocol. So we're building a lot of the infrastructure in the nature space, which is going to be critically needed. But similarly, it's happening fast. So it's a bit late, but it's happening very fast. And so, yeah, we're developing these methodologies for companies to set science-based targets on fresh water, on oceans, and on land, with biodiversity feeding into each of those targets, whether that be terrestrial or marine. We're developing the freshwater targets are already out as a version 1, or they've been released for public consultation, and the land version 1 targets will be coming out early next year. So yes, you're right. Certainly, some of that infrastructure is not quite in place yet, but we're working on it. And maybe just like one final point on kind of the social element to this. So Alberto showed kind of a slide at the beginning which had various different pathways to net zero. You know, in theory, all net zero means is that we, like, whatever's left, we remove. But there are many different pathways to net zero. And the one that SBTi is really promoting is a pathway where we have these deep emissions reductions and rely as little, as much as possible on the removals. Why? Because the more removals we have, the riskier, essentially, because those technologies do not exist at scale at cheap enough costs today. We're also pushing the burden onto future generations if we don't do anything today. And also we don't really have enough land in order to deliver that much removals. So SBTi's whole kind of approach in terms of incentivizing abatement is built on this essentially sustainable development pathway where we're reducing as much as possible. We ensure that's compatible with food security and the delivery of other global goals. So yes, while the SBTi is looking at GHG emissions, inherent within the methodology is a very strong social equity lens. Emma, MRV.
I'll be very brief. So currently the SBTi, I think maybe Alberto didn't mention it in his presentation. So currently the SBTi is focused on target setting. So what is the ambition required for a company to be in line with 1.5C? What do I need to do by 2025 or 2030 or 2050? What is that pathway? So what we do at the moment is we provide that guidance, but we also validate targets. So we have a separate arm of the SBTi that companies submit their targets into, and then they will be verified and then published on our website. What we're starting to move more towards is how is that company performing? So we're currently developing a new standard to understand what it means for a company to be on track, off track, or have actually achieved their targets. There's a question about, who will actually validate that, but what we're doing at the moment is trying to understand what it means to be making progress towards a science-based target. Hopefully that answered your question. So I think we probably have time for 2 more questions. I saw your hand go up before. Yeah.
I have 2 questions. And so I am David. I am working for Business Network, and I am French. I'm sorry, Kaya. And it's funny because French people tend to think about Switzerland when it's about neutrality. But, no, I'm kidding. Okay. Well, anyway, thank you for your work on the guidance. And my first question is actually on the ISO standard, because there was work on a carbon neutrality ISO standard a while ago, so I was wondering, where is it now? Is it suspended? Is it totally stopped? Will it restart later? And my second question is going to be about the MRV and the delivery of science-based targets. It's a tricky question. So you mentioned, Emma, it might be now on the regulatory side, and I think it's a good question to know what's going now to be the role of voluntary action on regulation regarding the implementation of targets. Thank you.
I can take the first one, and then you might have to repeat the second one. There's something called ISO 14068, which is an update to the carbon neutrality standards. So you might be familiar with PAS, I think it's 2060, which I think, so 14068, from what I've seen of it, hasn't been published, will be a higher standard for carbon neutrality, but still not as strict as the net zero guidelines. So they make a clear distinction between net zero and carbon neutrality within the ISO system, and carbon neutrality is seen as a step on the path to net zero, which is of course a step on the path to getting to zero and net negative ideally.
So if there's a lot of background noise, so I did struggle a bit to understand your question, but I think you were asking about the MRV projects in relation. So the question that the previous audience member asked, so that's the MRV project essentially that we're working on. So trying to understand the performance against targets. I'm sorry, I didn't hear it properly, but was it about timelines? We can maybe.
Actually, the question is about the responsibility. Who is going to do it? Will SBTi do the MRV forever?
Okay.
In which range? Or will it the regulation? So what do you think? What will happen, or what should happen?
Well, I think that's a question to be answered, to be honest. We're working through that internally as to see what the best and most robust model we can follow is. So we are actually kind of separating into 2 legal entities. So our target validation service will be a separate legal entity. However, for the MRV piece, that is still something that we're working through. Right now, we're just trying to understand what it means to perform against the target. And then we'll be working through that in 2023. Sorry, I can't answer. Okay, I think we can do one more. Yeah, we can do one more question.
Thank you. Charles-Henri Robert from French again, and the European Chemical Association. Probably a question for Scarlett. How do you handle, let's say, CCU, CO2-based plastics? How do you account for this production, knowing that you cannot assess or know what will be its end of life 20 years later? But then you have avoided to take fossil during its lifetime. So how do you handle that?
You have to repeat the last bit, in its lifetime.
By producing these plastics, you have avoided to take some fossil during 20 years. So there's an avoidance, but you don't know what will be the end of life of the product. How do you
So I think this is more of a greenhouse gas protocol question in terms of how companies account for the end of life impact of their products. And essentially what a company would do when they're generating their greenhouse gas inventory is they would look at their scope 3 emissions. So that's both upstream. So if you're buying plastic, what is the kind of emissions associated with that plastic and how it was produced? And then if you're purchasing plastic products and then potentially selling them on to consumers and then they're being dumped in the ocean or however that plastic is being disposed of, what is the impact of that? So it's just one of the scope 3 categories, and it's a real challenge for companies essentially to measure the emissions impact of their products once they go to consumers. And I don't have a clear answer. Maybe you have more experience of how companies are actually measuring it. But a lot of the big food and beverage companies are doing amazing work in terms of trying to understand where their products are going and how they're being disposed of. But yeah, I don't know whether Emma has a clearer answer based on the Scope 3 project, or I think it's a greenhouse gas protocol question essentially. Which is a perfect example of how the standards kind of reference each other. Like everybody's dealing with a different part of the system. Some is about how you account, some is about how you reduce, etc.
Thank you, Scarlett. So I think this brings us to the end of this evening's session. I'm sure that you can all see that there's plenty of drinks waiting to be drunk over on the side, and I'm sure you're ready to have one. So I really do hope that you'll join us for the next hour. But I just wanted to say a big thank you to you all for the great attendance that we've had today. Thank you to Alberto. And thank you so much to the amazing panelists that have joined us this evening.
Thank you.
What?
Excuse me?
We have a message that we're actually going to play. I wasn't aware. Apologies.
Hello. I'm Luis Amaral, CEO of the Science Based Targets Initiative. Welcome to our COP27 reception. I'm recording this in the Blue Zone during week 1, and unfortunately, I cannot stay in Egypt to be with all of you on this evening tonight. While I cannot be there in person, many of my fantastic SBTi team is there, and I have no doubt there will be a vibrant debate and discussions among them and many of the colleagues, stakeholders, and partners present today. Thank you all for taking the time during this busy COP and to spend time with us discussing how we can enable and drive in even more corporate climate action. The message from the last COP was clear. The window to keep global heating below 1.5 is closing fast. If we have any chance of keeping global heating below catastrophic levels, every business must play its part. The good news is that a growing number of companies are leading the way when it comes to ambitious corporate climate action, and often going further and faster than governments. The one tried and tested way to demonstrate this ambition is by setting a science-based target, by setting a plan of what success looks like. more than 4,000 companies worldwide have already committed to setting an SBT. And half of them have already delivered their targets for validation, which is what really counts. At this COP, we're calling even more businesses to commit to targets, more businesses to set targets, and more businesses to have them validated. And here's the important part. More businesses to take the actions that are needed to deliver against those plans. Also, this is an African COP. So I also wanted to highlight and champion the benefits of SBTi in driving much needed finance to developing nations and encouraging companies to invest their decarbonization efforts in these parts of their operations, on their supply chains. It's very likely that investing on your operations in developing countries will deliver the biggest bang for the buck. So I encourage companies to look beyond just their headquarters and then their global operations to drive investment on the developing world. They will need that if they want to achieve their global SBTIs. Finally, I want to take a moment to recognize the enormous work that has gone into getting us here today. SBTi has collaboration as its core, and we wouldn't be here without the support of our partners, WWF, WRI, UN Global Compact, CDP, and Winning Business Coalition. Thank you all for the partnership and the support. We also would not be here if it wasn't for the thousands of companies, literally thousands of companies, that are taking ambitious commitments and taking leadership on how to tackle our global climate crisis. Thank you for all that have joined SBTi, and thank you for all for being here tonight.